Metal Gear Solid 2 is one of those rare games that people are still arguing about more than 20 years later. Some players look back at it as one of the boldest sequels ever made, a game that challenged its audience and predicted ideas that feel strangely relevant today. Others still remember the moment they realised they weren't actually going to be playing as Solid Snake for most of the game, and they never quite forgave it. Even now, the debate hasn't really been settled. Was Metal Gear Solid 2 a work of genius that was simply ahead of its time, or was it a betrayal of the expectations that the original game built? I think the reason people still talk about it is because the experience of discovering what Metal Gear Solid 2 actually was felt very different from what anyone thought they were getting. My introduction to the world of Metal Gear Solid started with the first game on the original PlayStation. I was young at the time, and like a lot of the games from that era, my first exposure to it wasn't actually playing it myself. It was watching my older brothers play it. I would sit there watching them work their way through Shadow Moses, slowly learning how the mechanics worked just by observing them. Eventually, I started playing it myself, but that process of watching, learning, and gradually understanding what the game was doing became a big part of how I experienced it. Up to that point, I'd never really seen a game that felt so cinematic or so ambitious in terms of storytelling. What struck me most about Metal Gear Solid back then was just how big the ideas felt. As a kid, I definitely didn't understand everything the game was trying to say. It was talking about nuclear weapons, genetics, political manipulation, soldiers being used as tools by governments, and all sorts of themes that were probably far bigger than anything I had encountered at that age. But even if I didn't fully grasp it all, I knew it felt important. Certain moments stuck with me immediately. The Psycho Mantis fight, where the game seemed to break the fourth wall and read your memory card, felt completely mind-blowing at the time. And then there were scenes like the death of Sniper Wolf, which suddenly slowed the whole story down and turned what could have been a simple action game into something much more emotional. Because of that experience, Metal Gear Solid became one of those games that really stuck with me during my formative years. It was one of the first times I realised that games could tell stories that felt just as serious and dramatic as films. So when the sequel was announced, the expectation was pretty simple. We are going to continue the story of Solid Snake. After everything that had happened in the first game, it felt natural that the next chapter would just build on that. And for a while, everything about Metal Gear Solid 2 seemed to reinforce that idea. Before the game released, I remember playing the demo over and over again. It let you play through the opening tanker section, sneaking around a snake while experimenting with all of the new mechanics. Even in that short slice, it was obvious how much the game had evolved from the original. The controls were smoother, the environments were more detailed, and the enemy AI seemed far more reactive. I spent a lot of time just messing around in that demo, trying different approaches and enjoying the feeling that this was clearly a huge step forward. And because that demo focused entirely on the tanker mission, the assumption was obvious. This was the beginning of another full game starring Solid Snake. When the game finally arrived, it starts exactly how you'd expect. The tanker chapter feels like a natural continuation of the first Metal Gear Solid. You're playing as Snake again, sneaking through tight corridors, listening to familiar voices over the codec, and uncovering another conspiracy involving Metal Gear technology. But then, something strange happens. After that opening mission ends, the story jumps forward, and suddenly you're controlling a completely different character, Raiden. For a lot of players, that moment was confusing at best and frustrating at worst. After spending years attached to Solid Snake as the protagonist of the series, suddenly being asked to play as someone else felt jarring. Raiden wasn't necessarily a bad character, but he was very different from Snake. Where Snake had this quiet confidence and clear sense of identity, Raiden initially felt much more uncertain and inexperienced. As a young player at the time, I remember feeling a bit caught off guard by it all. Like most people who had played the first game, I'd expected to continue that journey with Snake. There were other moments that made the whole situation even stranger. The appearance of the mysterious character Iroquois Pliskin is probably the most obvious example. The game treats his identity as something of a secret, but to most players it was pretty obvious that this was actually Snake in disguise. I remember thinking at the time that the twist didn't really land the way the game seemed to intend, because it was so clear who he was. But even with those odd narrative choices, there was no denying that Metal Gear Solid 2 was doing something incredibly ambitious. Looking back now, it's impossible to ignore how much the game pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time. Technically, it was a massive leap forward from the original game. The environments were far more complex, the AI reacted to the player behaviour in ways that felt advanced for that era, and the cinematic presentation was on another level entirely. But more importantly, the story was attempting something that very few big games would dare to do. Instead of simply giving players more of what they expected, it deliberately challenged their expectations. That's where the real debate about Metal Gear Solid 2 begins. For some people, the decision to replace Snake with Raiden felt like a betrayal. It was as if the game had promised one thing and then delivered something else entirely. But for others, that same decision is exactly what makes the game so interesting. By forcing players to see the story through the eyes of someone who idolizes Snake, the game turns the player themselves into part of the narrative. Raiden becomes a reflection of the audience, stepping into a world shaped by legends he only partially understands. Over time, the reputation of Metal Gear Solid 2 has changed quite dramatically. When it first released, the conversation was dominated by disappointment and confusion, but as the years passed, more and more people began to revisit it and notice how eerily relevant some of its themes were. The game talks about the manipulation of information, the spread of digital misinformation, and the way systems control what people see and believe. Ideas that might have felt abstract back then suddenly feel surprisingly familiar today. For me personally, my feelings about the game have definitely evolved. As a kid, I was mostly focused on the surface level experience. I enjoyed the stealth gameplay and appreciated the technical improvements, but the narrative choices sometimes felt strange or confusing. With time and perspective, I've come to appreciate just how bold those choices were. Metal Gear Solid 2 was willing to take risks in a way that very few big budget games would attempt today. And that's really the heart of the question surrounding this game. Was Metal Gear Solid 2 a brilliant piece of storytelling that was simply misunderstood when it first released? Or did it push its audience away by refusing to give them the experience they thought they were getting? Even now, the answer probably depends on who you ask. That's why the conversation around Metal Gear Solid 2 never really goes away. For some people, it remains one of the most daring and thought-provoking games ever made. For others, it is still the sequel that replaced the hero they loved with someone who never quite filled those shoes. And maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. What I'd really be interested to hear is how you experienced it. Did you play the demo like I did and assume the whole game would be about Snake? Were you excited when Raiden appeared, or did it feel like the game had pulled the rug out from under you? And looking back now, do you see Metal Gear Solid 2 as a work of genius, or as a sequel that took one risk too many? Because more than 2 decades later, people are still arguing about it, and that alone might say everything about the kind of game Metal Gear Solid 2 really was. Thanks for watching.